And we are live. Welcome to Level Up, the Career Playbook. This is the podcast where we dive into the stories, the strategies, the skills that are going to help take your career to the next level. I'm Brian Bell, your host, and I'm so excited to have you join us for this journey. This podcast is not just about climbing the ladder. It's about mastering your craft. It's about falling in love with the process, embracing the mentality of excellence. At Mamba HR, the sponsor of this podcast, we've taken inspiration from Kobe Bryant's Mamba Mentality, a philosophy about committing to the process, not just the destination. Kobe taught us that true greatness comes from a relentless dedication to honing your craft. And while we often think of this in the realm of sports, the same applies to your work and your career. So whether you're an HR professional, and even though I'm an HR professional, our first guest is an HR professional, and of course the tool Mamba HR is about HR, whether you're in HR, whether you're a people manager, customer success leader, an individual contributor, the best of the best do not stumble into success. They take their craft seriously. And that's what this podcast and Mamba HR is all about. Mamba HR and this podcast started almost by accident about 5 years ago. My co-founder, Kelly Inman, and myself were both HR business partners. And one day, Kels reached out to me and said she needed a simple performance improvement template. Now, I had one from my company that I used, but it wasn't templatized. It wasn't easy for her to use. So like most people, we turned to Google. We landed on SHRM's website, the Society for Human Resource Management. Now, they're like the gurus of all things HR, and you get certifications there. Now, they have a place where you can get free templates, but all of them look like they were from 1992. They were really bad, to be honest with you. And so we realized that simple, usable HR tools for professionals, managers, ICs, they really just didn't exist. And so that's where the idea of Mamba HR was born, from a need to make being your best at work simple, accessible, and actionable. Because let's face it, HR, it's not rocket science. HR is for everyone. And our mission at Mamba HR is to build a better workday for all. And this podcast is an extension of that mission. Now, today, I'm excited, I'm thrilled, I'm over the moon to introduce our very first guest of our very first podcast, Meredith Tsang. She's a powerhouse leader in people business partnerships and talent management. Meredith has a wealth of experience, and she's here to share her story, her playbook for success, and actionable advice to help level up in your career. Before I get to you, Meredith, I want to make a quick story about Meredith and I worked together a couple years back, and when she started, from very beginning, I realized, oh, wow, she's great. She's good at what she does. She's amazing. And she made me level up how I show up to work every single day. It was immediate. As soon as I saw how she operated, I knew that I needed to take another step up because she really brought something that I wasn't used to and I never really saw before. And the way that she approached work was something that I wanted to mimic immediately. Since then, Meredith and I have been staying in touch. I call her a great friend. She's an actual inspiration. And if you look, Meredith, I have about 10 years on you, but because I might have more age, that does not mean that I have more experience, and I'm learning from as many people as possible. And that's what the point of this podcast also is. I wanted to figure out how can I pull from the brains of the best, like Meredith, and many of our other podcasts are going to be from the best of the industry, to figure out what are they doing? How do they think? And so we all together can learn how to be the best at our jobs, because we're not going to join the NFL tomorrow or the NBA, but in our professional environment, in our careers, we can be the best. So that is how Meredith ended up here. And I am super excited to welcome our very first guest, my good friend, Meredith Tsang. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing, Meredith?
I'm doing great, Brian. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to help you launch the podcast. You're a great colleague and a great friend. So it's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we have 1 hour, so we have quite a bit to talk about. And it's not an accident that you are my first guest. Like I said, you have really inspired me to be better, and you just take this really practical approach. And so what I want to do is just try to pull out of your brain as much of that insight and how you got to the place that you are as being as amazing as you are in being an HR business partner. So before we get started, as I mentioned, Meredith, you are an HR or a people business partner. What the heck is that?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'll summarize this by saying an HR business partner is someone who is typically behind the scenes in most cases. So it's probably not a surprise if a lot of people aren't familiar with what we do. It's a little bit more than being a generalist, which is, just being reactive to situations that happen, situations, something goes a little hairy or, seeing procedure. What an HR business partner, what I think a successful HR business partner does is works very closely with the leadership team to make sure that they have the resources to really think through, do they have the right talent? What kind of decisions do they need to make around the talent on their team? How do they manage through change? I think this is fair to say for anybody who has worked maybe Brian and I have worked in the tech space where things are often quite chaotic. You can know that team dynamics are often a really big contributing factor to that. And our role is really to make sure that we're partnering with leaders to make sure we're minimizing as much of that chaos as possible in order to create an environment where people can do their best and are able to understand, what are the goals and how do we achieve those.
It sounds like a lot. We'll get to a lot of this hopefully as we go through this podcast, but I didn't know this job existed 15 years ago until I had a leader sit down and say, hey, I think you'd be good at this. And I'm like, oh, this sounds amazing. So we'll dive into how the heck did you get here? But let's start from the beginning. Now, the podcast, of course, has got that sports-related theme. So each of our segments are going to be more sports-related. The first one is going to be the pregame. And so in the pregame, let's talk about, Meredith, about, your early life, your education, the formative experiences. So let's start from the very beginning. What were some key experiences growing up or in school, just in your life, that sets you on this path to get you to HR and talent management?
Yeah. I need to say, I think in terms of my motivations in my career, I'd say it was primarily driven by a couple of things. The first is personality wise, I'm a pretty big introvert. I'm pretty open with that and just knowing a lot about myself, but I'm very interested in people. And the way that I would describe that is I'm interested in people, but I'm not necessarily interested in spending all of my time with people. So I'm very interested in, people's motivations. And when I was younger, that often came across in my interests. I was very interested in fiction, literature. You can understand people's motivations in, great works of art. Also just learning about different cultures. And when I went to college, I actually ended up studying cultural anthropology, which has a lot to do with understanding systems and how people operate within those systems. And when I think about the work that I do today, it's very similar. You're working within, a closed environment, a company that has its own ecosystem and has its own players. And I really get the opportunity to understand how do all these different departments, how all these different characters and personalities really impact the way that this organization is operating. And I'll say, I think another motivation in terms of driving my career was the education system that I had the opportunity to attend. So I went to public school system that was in California in the Bay Area, where we're both, you live now. I don't live there now, but we're both kind of familiar with the area.
Meredith, come back.
And I went to a school that was very close to an area that had a lot of gang-related activity at that time. So to put that into perspective, in order to get into school, you had to go through metal detectors. A lot of people had, a lot of violence in the area. It was a very chaotic environment. And I think what I learned from that, that experience was, I didn't grow up in a school where there were small class sizes. You kind of had to advocate for yourself. And I think that was something that really continued to be a constant theme in my life, in my career, was having this ability to advocate for myself. I ended up going to community college after I graduated from high school. Again, a lot of resources and a lot of personalized attention. I had to really, in order to transfer to a four-year university, had to do my own research on what were the classes that I need to take with the prerequisites. There were literally no college counselors. There were, but you would go there. I remember I went there once and there was just nobody there. They just gave me a piece of paper and said, you're going to have to figure this out. If you want to, figure out how to transfer, you can come back maybe in like 2 weeks. So there was a constant theme there of having to figure it out for yourself. And when I did eventually transfer to four-year university, it kind of made me realize, I guess, that wasn't necessarily the case for everyone. Now, granted, I grew up in a pretty stable middle class family. I had a really good, strong, stable environment. Parents always valued education, but I didn't get that kind of personalized attention that a lot of students who went to the school that I ended up transferring did, in terms of having small class sizes, having college counselors along the way. So I think by the time I got to that point, it was pretty well ingrained to me that, like, hey, if you want to figure this out, you're going to have to find that path on your own and make sure that you advocate for yourself in order to achieve that.
I don't want you to glance over, you said the school that I transferred into, just so everybody knows now, you went to UC Berkeley. So that's just not something you sweep over. How did you end up at UC Berkeley? And I want you to tie that into, how did your experience at UC Berkeley land you in HR? Was there something that happened there at school, at an amazing school like that, that said, you know what, HR is the path?
So to answer the first part of your question, I went because I grew up in the area. It was literally 5 miles from where I grew up and where I was living. So, I think for me, thinking financially, it was a good opportunity just to stay in the area and really be able to focus on my future going forward. There wasn't necessarily anything there that propelled me on the road to HR specifically. I actually was interested first in education, and I did actually have the opportunity to work after I graduated from college, to work at a K through 8 school with first graders. And honestly, in a lot of ways, HR is not very much different from that, because one of my favorite things to do was to read the discipline reports about all the crazy stuff that people do, which is very similar to what I often do today. Putting that aside, there wasn't really anything that propelled me. When I graduated from college and I ended up moving to New York a year after I had worked at this school, I had a partner at the time. He was going to pursue a master's degree in New York, and I just needed a job. I was at that place where I just have a general liberal arts bachelor's degree. I'm just going to apply for anything that will take
Same.
me. I applied to marketing roles. I applied to, any sort of just general work I thought I could do. And I ended up taking a job as a recruiting coordinator. And that was really my first exposure to this world of HR.
Okay, so very helpful. Berkeley, though, and growing up in the area, especially like you said with metal detectors, it's just crazy. Then you say it, and when we work together, you never mention it, but those formative years, I do think it's starting to make more sense of, you show up very cool and calm and collective, and it seems like maybe the experience you've had previously just don't throw you off. So it's interesting. All right, let's move on to the second segment. This is called the Power Up. Let's talk about building up your skills and the career milestones to get to where you are now. You began your career, like you said, you just took a job, and I think one of your first roles is an HR analyst. What specific skills or the early experiences to help set that foundation, and what did you learn as a part of doing that role?
Yeah. So at this role, and at this company, it was about a 500-person organization. So I had the opportunity to really dabble in a lot of things. I was doing recruiting coordinating, I was doing onboarding, I was doing orientation, I was doing just, random stuff that kind of, maybe touched the HR business partner world. But I would say one of the most formative experiences I've had was the person who actually hired me was a really, really good mentor to me at a point in my career. She really invested in my development. I think she did a lot of things that even today I appreciate. Like when I started, we didn't necessarily have like a dedicated desk space to put me. So she offered to let me sit in her office. She gave me like a little nice onboarding package. And I think it goes a lot for me to say that I started to recognize that way that people lead does really affect the output that you get from the people who you hire. She really demonstrated that she cared about my success, and I wanted to put in more because of that. And I also had the opportunity to learn from her. She was very experienced in, the world of recruiting, had previously been an executive recruiter. And I would literally just sit in her office and listen to her make her pitch over and over and over. I would see how she would personalize it. I could see how when it clearly wasn't going well, she knew how to end the call very quickly to not waste her time. And I think having that exposure to like, wow, somebody actually really cares about the thing that they do, and to the point where they've been able to refine it to this extent, was really opening to me. I think especially when you get out of college, you're kind of bummed that you have to work at all. Like making that transition from, I have 2 classes today and I'm going to go and study and then get a coffee and then watch some TV and then maybe I'll do my essay to, oh my gosh, I have to sit here for 40 hours every week. You're really kind of bummed out. And I think I was inspired by the fact that somebody was finding it invigorating and finding some excitement in the thing that they were doing. So that gave me some level of hope, like, hey, like maybe if I put in some, the effort, I can achieve that as well.
So that's a key call out. So you go to school for anthropology. You didn't think about, I'm going to start a career in HR, right? You still weren't quite sure. You travel all the way across the country. You move across the country. And it was, let me take any job I can get. And so what I'm trying to get at is, for people trying to break into HR specifically, because I have a lot of people that reach out to me, just randoms on LinkedIn and some of my old friends and colleagues, I want to get into HR. What would be, it feels like you lucked out there in the role, but if you were 10, 15 years ago and you were trying to break into HR now, would you say the same thing, apply for an HR analyst role or a generalist role? How would you break into HR now if you were going to do it again?
A really good question. I would probably say, I think I would agree with your advice. I think getting your foot in the door is oftentimes the most important step. Like, I think once you make that step, that's like 70 to 80% of the work done, just getting in that position and getting that exposure. I would say the remaining 30 to 20% of being able to, make your way a little bit further is the drive and the application of yourself of that process. So the things that I would say are some of the most important things. And what I will say is, like, now that I'm a manager and a leader myself, a lot more wisdom around, what are the characteristics that people who are looking to develop someone are actively looking for and are receptive to you. I would say those things are having natural curiosity. I think, if you're trying to develop somebody, you don't want somebody who's, going to be sitting there waiting to get the answers. You want somebody who is eager to learn. And I would say the second thing is, really trying to do a good job. I think it can't be understated, just wanting to do a good job. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go above and beyond for every single thing. But I think you recognize when someone their drive for their motivation is coming internally on, I want to be able to accomplish this. I want to move forward, and not necessarily trying to achieve exactly like you said, like the theme of on the HR. It's like not just the destination, but actually having some a joy in being able to learn and develop and grow your skills.
Another thing that you mentioned was you had, your very first manager or one of your first managers really took you under their wing and sat you next to them. So you really learned what a great leader, what a great HR person, what a great recruiter does. And that shadowing is what we all know is something that's very important. But I don't think that happens for most of us in our careers. It took me a few jobs until I had one leader that just said, Brian, and we would sit down and talk about all the roles and how they work and what the metrics are to succeed. And that really changed my life. And you had that same thing. Now, the question for you is, was that luck that you had a leader that took you under their wing and really showed you the ropes, and I think has really set you on this path to be absolutely, to me, the best HR business partner I've ever worked with? Was that just because they were this wonderful person? Or was that because of what you said? You showed up with this curiosity and this eagerness. It was the chicken or the egg situation. Which one happened first? Because what I'm trying to get at for the people that are watching is, go and find a great leader, or go and just kill it. Any great leader will find you. And how does that work out so you kind of get lucky?
Yeah. I want to be pragmatic with my response, because I do want to recognize that, there is some level of probability involved, right? Like, some people may be have the luck of not being able to run into somebody who, knows a lot. And, there are a lot of bad managers out there. I think that's fair to say, Brian, you and I as HR professionals, we know there are quite a bit of bad managers out there. And there's probably only a certain percentage that is conscientious and looking to develop people. But I think the thing that I would advise is try to keep your eye out for those people. Like, I think you have to actively be looking for people who you think can mentor you. And the thing that I will say is those people are often very, very, very receptive to wanting to be active in other people's development. And you have to put that energy out there. And I'll give an example for myself. One of the ways that I think I was able to continue along, like I would say at every stage of my career, I've always felt that I've had someone I can learn and I can be mentored by. And one of the things that I think how I was able to accomplish that was actually being genuinely curious in how did exactly, like the theme of this podcast again, like genuinely being curious on how did they become who they were to this day. And I remember, asking questions and being on the phone with people that maybe I didn't work with directly. Maybe they were 2 or 3 steps removed from me, either laterally or vertically, but still using that as an opportunity to really dig into their experiences and dig into, what is it that you do all day? What are the things that go into that? And I would spend literally hours with another one of my mentors where she would just tell me about the things and the roles that she had and what she was doing today and what her thought process was. And yes, I do think that I was very fortunate to have encountered somebody like that who was willing to develop that in me. But again, at the same time, I've had the foresight now to look back and say I was probably actively searching for that.
And that's a good call. I think you probably had a leader that invested in you because they saw that you genuinely wanted more. Do you think that any of your anthropology background, did you develop any skills that helped you also in your curiosity or figuring out what other people do? Or let's just even talk specifically about being an HR analyst. Was there any tie-ins to what you learned? I can tell you right now, I wish I could tell you that I learned something that, like, back when I did my MBA, this thing is applied to what I do and showing up for work, but I don't remember any of that. And so was there any skills that you could say tied into even very early on in your career or even now?
There were actually. When I was in college, because I had a focus in cultural anthropology, we had to take a course in how are you going to conduct an ethnography. So one of the projects that we had was we had to go out and find like a subculture, like, some people had chosen, like a music scene or, people who were doing drug rehabilitation. And you literally had to go there and understand the way, the norms and the goals and how they operated. And one of the things that actually really stuck with me in that course was we had one day a full discussion dedicated to just purely, how do you interview somebody? How do you get somebody to open up and, be able to share information with yourself? And these were really literally like very basic things, but it is a skill that I probably wouldn't have acquired those techniques if I didn't take that class. For example, one of the, very basic thing was, when you're sitting with somebody, like, don't sit directly across them and, give this very imposing, you want to make your body language inviting so that people feel like they will feel comfortable giving you information. So I feel like there were practical skills, but I feel like that's the same with anything, right? If you are actively involved in learning, you will find that there are really applicable ways in your life that you can apply that to that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good call. So there are ties to skills that you learn if you go to school, or even if it's high school. You don't necessarily have to go to a graduate or undergraduate degree, but there are skills that we are able to tie into this career, especially in HR. So that's good to know.
Yeah. And I will say specifically, it doesn't necessarily have to be with anthropology or anything like that. I think one of the most critical skills that you can take away from education is your ability to think critically. And I would say that is probably the thing that makes individuals stand out in a corporate environment if you're looking to further your career. always ask that question one more time. Try to go a little bit deeper each time if you're, leading with that natural curiosity.
I have to dig there. You did give a little bit of explanation, but critical thinking, and that's going to go into my next question. We have these buzzwords, especially in corporate America, especially in HR, and critical thinking. Yes, I could go to Google or ChatGPT and look it up, but when you think about the workplace and as an HR manager now, how does that show up? What does that look like if somebody is good at critical thinking or applies critical thinking? And maybe that's a better way to put it. What does that look like at work?
It's a good question. And I will say, I'll try to answer this as succinctly as I can. I think it really means understanding the why of why you're doing something. And I think don't just do something for the sake of doing something. I think it's fair to say there are always going to be administrative things that have to be done, but there are always opportunities to make improvements in whether that means innovation or whether that means efficiency. And I'll just use a very practical example from the HR business partner space myself. We're hiring a bunch of roles and we're seeing a lot of attrition within a certain span of time, people who are leaving before we would like them to. Get the opportunity to really sit down and ask, like, why is this happening? And really look at all the different levers that are available. Is it because we're not hiring the right people? Is it because the managers aren't providing the right kind of support during the onboarding process? And I think that having that critical thinking lens, right, and really having the ability to, one, understand what are the root causes, and diving deep into each of those is what critical thinking in practice really looks like. And I'll say this, especially if you're trying to apply what you've learned in school, the 5-paragraph essay that you learn when you're in high school, it always works. Like, everything is just that. Have an introduction, understand what it is, find some data to support that, and then based on what you're finding, what is your recommendation based on that? It's very 5-paragraph essay. It'll serve you well if you can dig that up out of your brain.
To give you some more kudos, I knew all that as being an HR business partner for a while, but a lot of it was I worked with leaders that were a little bit more loosey-goosey, so I just would kind of go off of my feelings and my instincts. And then when I saw how you approached the game, it really was kind of more academic, where it had kind of the one-pager and the work that showed how you got to where you were going. Now, maybe you were always that way, but when I think about somebody that's newer, earlier in their career, and their manager, they're the CEO or the director or the VP says, Meredith, go do this thing. How do you say what, why, how? How do you say that in a way that I might be intimidated? This big leader tells me to go do it. I should just go do it, right? Isn't that the way I should approach it?
It's a good question. And what I'll say to that is there's a fine line to be balanced between asking for more clarity in a way that makes it seem like you're challenging or you're being obstinate versus asking so that you can do a better job. And that's what I would really hinge on, is if you're being asked to do something, just think about it in terms of, I want to make sure I fully understand so that I can do the best job as I possibly can.
Yeah, that's a very good call out. Let's move forward. A company called Blend. Let's use another buzzword here. You were there during an intense scaling phase. First, before we go down what that looked like and what skills you prioritized, especially in Silicon Valley in the tech world, scale. We have to build a scale. We're scaling. What does scale and scaling mean to you? And then if you can just keep going from there of what skills do you have to have in order to be good at scaling? What does good scaling look like?
Yeah. So to put this into perspective, when I joined that company, I think it was about 500 people or so. And they were in the process. When I joined on my first day, they told me, hey, by the way, we're going to sign a deal for an acquisition tomorrow. And we're going to be acquiring 700 people. Oh, we're going to effectively double in size overnight. So I was like, okay, I guess this is what we're doing now. And when you think about, I think, being strategic and working through scale, obviously in this situation, right, like things are going to change overnight. You can't keep operating the way that you have historically because you're just absorbing all of this additional overhead. You're absorbing all this additional volume. I think when you think about it from an HR lens, right, that's twice as many inquiries, that's twice as many performance reviews, that's twice as many compensation recommendations that have to be made. So it's really important that as you're scaling, you're building the infrastructure and able to support that, because you don't want to be caught back-footed eventually and not have that, that infrastructure in place. That's the one thing I would say. But I would say when you're thinking about scaling, the second thing that's important to remember is you have to make trade-offs eventually, right? You can't necessarily always provide the same level of, you can provide probably the same level of service, but you probably can't do it in the way that you did historically, with especially in HR where teams historically are, pretty lean. You really have to be conscious of how are we going to maintain a certain level of service, because we can't hire, another 7 HR coordinators. It's just not effective. And, that's never going to get approved by finance when they look at the cost structures of HR teams at other organizations. So making sure you have a really clear idea of, if I have to, dedicate more resources to this, what's the trade-off that we're going to make? Maybe that doesn't mean you table it or you never do it, but, start thinking about your roadmap on, if this is something that we have to provide, when is that going to be, and how long can we survive without that?
Yeah, I look back at my career and I'm like, I actually was responsible for helping to scale. When you bring in tools, when you automate, when you do more with less, that's scaling. But I never thought about that I actively were helping to scale. It was always a manager said, we need to have this tool to do X, Y, and Z. So I kind of followed in line. Now that you have the experience, are you actively thinking about how you can help scale, how you can help automate? If you're new to your career or in the middle of your career, is this something that I can show up and say, hey, I have this idea to help make things simplified? Or should I sit back and wait for the business to tell me what to do, because I don't want to look like Mr. Smarty Pants or somebody that's always trying to, add drama to the workplace?
Yeah. So I'll again share from my own personal experience. I think I was very fortunate to have exposure to what a fully scaled organization looks like before I dove head into, let me be part of the scaling process. So when I was early in my career, I was working at Thomson Reuters, which was a 50 to 60,000 person organization, massive global organization. But during the time I was there, they went through a divestiture of one of their business units, and they were divesting effectively 20,000 people in order to be backed by private equity. So the amount of just work that goes into making something like that happen, right? You're basically cutting the organization in half and trying to stand it up itself. I was very fortunate to have the exposure on, like, okay, this organization has already achieved scale. They've outsourced. They have the systems. They have the teams and processes built in place to have effectively scaled up to this point. Now we just have to replicate that over here. So I think I was very fortunate to be able to see that. To go back to your question on how would I recommend somebody think about that, I would say, if you have the opportunity to do that, that's great. Now, I know that not everybody may want to work at a really large organization, but my recommendation would be to think about where you may be in 2 to 3 years' time and actively try to work towards that state.
So being intentional with how you are at work, and obviously in the process asking the 5 whys, but it's not just about today. It's thinking through, okay, what skills can I learn from the company I'm at now to get me to the next company, and being intentional there as well always has to be in the back of your mind. So that's a good call. Moving forward a little bit, how do you stay on top of, especially in HR? I think with any kind of industry or role, there's always things that you need to know to be an expert, and there's all these best practices, and with AI happening, there's changes happening at paces that we can't imagine. But especially in HR and in talent management, how do you stay on top of knowing everything? I know for me, especially at this level, I don't know everything. But when you're at a director, let's say, level and up, you're expected to know everything. So there's kind of 2 lenses here. When you're early in your career, I think it's easier to ask people. When you're more in your middle career and where you are now, You have to go and find that information. How are you staying on top of it? And how do you go and ask other people advice or just the best practices to do it without being judged? Because a lot of times people expect us to show up fully baked and to know everything. So how do you manage all of that?
So I think to answer the first part of your question on how do you manage your time and stay on top of things, I think for me, time management and calendar management is really important. I know it sounds really basic, and maybe you're like me and you get recommended on YouTube videos all the time, advertisements all the time on how to, maximize your calendar. But for me, I think it goes back to just a couple of really simple principles. Is one, I try not to have meetings in the morning so I can make sure that my day structured out. Now, granted, I am a very analytical person, so this may not work for everybody. I think the important thing here is to find something that works for you. But for me personally, it works really well not to have a lot of meetings in the morning, to have meetings throughout kind of like afternoon for, 3, 4, however many hours I need to have them. And then kind of wrap up the day with, okay, what did I accomplish? Did I accomplish everything I needed to do? And one thing that I will say is also, I think, really important for me is, especially with meetings, is to have a really clear picture of what it is that you're trying to get out of them. Don't just go to a meeting and expect things to happen. Your time is precious, so don't just give it away. A really clear picture in your mind of these are, you don't have to have an agenda and read them verbatim like a committee, but at least for yourself, set a goal of, by the time I leave this meeting, I want to make sure I know that we're moving forward on, these 2 or 3 things, and be able to say that was a practical or, that was a successful meeting. To go to the second part of your question about how do you, continue to make sure that you know what's going on and, you can ask people questions. I think it goes back again to what we said, right? It's if you have the right intentions on asking this because I want to be able to do a good job, people will more often than not be open with you. And if they're not, then that tells you a lot about their character. And that, I think if you lead with the energy of, I'm trying to do this with good intent, I'm not doing this just because of my own personal motivations, I really want to be able to do a good job, people will be receptive to that most of the time.
That's a good call. It's how you show up. If you're asking questions when you clearly haven't tried to do some of your own research and you're just asking and hoping people give you the answer, that's probably, you're right, that's where the judgment will come versus, oh, you really came with a full kind of book, but you're trying to add a little bit to it. All right, let's move on to the next section of this next segment called the playbook. So we're going to talk more about the strategies and success. We've already kind of gone into that, but we're going to dive in a little bit more. You, in your role now, you have to partner closely with C-level VPs, the executives, the senior levels across functions. How do you do that? How do you make sure that, just what the HR team wants and what your executive wants, how do you make sure that they match? How do you actually just show up working with an executive? To show up to support a C-level person or a senior leader could be very intimidating. And so is there a course that you learned in how to have executive presence? Did they just throw you to the wolves, or did you have a chance to get exposed to it in some type of way? I know this is a huge question, but how do you work with executives and senior leaders, and how did you figure out how to do it the best way?
Yeah. So I'll answer this in 2 parts. I think the first part of the question is how do you align, their goals with your goals? And I think it goes to say, to simplify that, is like their goals are my goals. Like they're running the business and I want the business to be successful. So let's not trying to align our agendas, right? I think there's often times where HR professionals and business leaders may have divergent opinions on what the best way to approach it is. But I think the important thing to remember is that we're trying to achieve the same thing at the end of the day. And what really makes that helpful for me is on getting to know what it is that those teams are trying to achieve, and just really understanding the practicality of like, what does that actually mean on a day-to-day basis? And oftentimes what that means, especially when you're dealing with people and teams, is how do I make this team as productive and as least chaotic as I possibly can. How can I make those, annoying problems that happen go away? And a lot of the times that is solved by, having really strong management, having people that lead effectively, having leaders that are invested in the growth of their team so that you don't have constant chatter about what's next for me, right? The teams are actively invested in, working together. So I would say that's one part of it. Now we could definitely get into more parts of, how to, the more kind of like drive workforce planning part of it. And you build out long-term scale plans of what this team is going to look like. I think that's probably not something we want to go to and super in depth here, but I think at the core of it is just understanding what does it actually mean practically and what kind of practical solutions can you offer. What I'll say to your second part of the question of how do you get used to working with executives, one thing that I would say is, again, I think I was very fortunate to, when you grow up in HR, if you have the opportunity to grow up in the business partner space, you're exposed to these leaders at a very early part of your career. At least I was, because I was given that opportunity to develop. So I think what I learned very early on is, again, ask for clarity. If you want to be seen as a good partner, make sure that you're following through on the thing that you're being asked. And one of the most important things of that is make sure you know what's being asked. I think oftentimes, especially when you're working with an executive who can have a really big personality, or, maybe things come out in moments of heat, which often do for executives who can often lead with very fiery red energy, is make sure you understand what you're being asked. And I think that oftentimes is respected. I think that's part of executive presence, is having an ability to match someone's energy, to be able to have a conversation with them. And I'll just end it on this point. I think oftentimes executives their humanity can oftentimes be lost, right? The higher you get up in the chain, the more you are actually judged for your ability to lead. And, are you following through on these things, to the point where they can oftentimes become characters of themselves. And I think it's important to remember that these are still people who are working, with really big problems that still have emotions, and being able to understand where they're coming from is something that will help you really develop a rapport with somebody at that level.
That's a good call. Remember, if they are still humans, and if you still recognize that humanity, you can break down that wall, ask the questions you need to, get follow-up to make sure you know what they really want. That's a really good call out. And I'm going to tuck that one in. Remember that these people are human, because sometimes, especially when it's executives and they have so much to do, we almost look at them as like demigods, right? And they're just infallible. And, break that down to no, they're still a human. So let's move forward, especially in the business partner world. You being a leader, you have to create performance frameworks and track metrics. What is successful? You need to figure out, what are we going to say success looks like? What are 3 metrics that every HR professional should focus on to drive impact?
Yeah, I think I'll answer this because I think the answer can be different depending on what kind of industry you work at and what kind of company you work at. So I'll answer this through the lens of like kind of the environment that you and I are familiar with, which is like a mid to late stage startup, probably like 500 to 1,500 employees. I would say definitely look at your attrition statistics. Make sure you understand how many people are leaving, why they're leaving. That will tell you a lot about the actual lived-in dynamics that people are experiencing on a day-to-day. I would say the second thing is, if you run, engagement surveys, people nowadays love to give feedbacks. So take advantage of that and really listen to what people are saying. That's going to be, I think, a huge one. And then I would say a third one would be, if you're able to measure manager effectiveness, that is one of the most important things I would say you can look at, because we all have opinions on our boss. I think that is fair to say. And people will oftentimes be very honest about that if, they feel like the conduit that they're giving it in is, a safe and protected space that they can give it. And I would say bad managers are probably one of the worst things that you can have for your organization, because the impact just multiplies when you have a bad manager, right? If they're managing one team that has 5 to 10 people, that's 5 to 10 people who are now having a terrible experience. And if you continue to multiply that you could still, at some point, that could be everybody. So make sure you look at that and make sure you're leading interventions to really fix that problem. Because I think when you think about across all levels, productivity, climate, culture, environment, those manager scores are going to tell you a lot.
So that manager effectiveness part, obviously there's the engagement survey, and hopefully at whatever company you're at, there's an actual section or questions that measure my manager knows what they're doing. They give me the tools I need to succeed, ... Are there other ways that you specifically and your teams go about to figure out how a manager is effective or not? Like, how else do you figure that out?
I think oftentimes having one-to-ones is really productive. I think, as an HR business partner, you should always have one-to-ones with your key stakeholders, whether that's like at the executive level, whether that's at the VP level, even at the director and the senior director level. And oftentimes in these conversations, you won't get the full picture always of what's going on, right? Because people can sometimes actively portray themselves in certain ways. And you have to be very discerning about what you hear from all different angles and, be able to create an informed perspective about this. One of our colleagues, actually, John Davidson, gave a really good example of this in terms of how he approaches it. He basically explained if there's an apple on the table, his job is to walk around the table and get a full picture of what that apple looks like. Because if you're sitting on this side, maybe it looks shadowy. If you're sitting on this side, maybe there's a big hole that you couldn't see on the other side. So I think it is very important to make sure that you can get the full picture before you make a recommendation.
That's a great way to look at it. I love JD. He also was another person that helped me kind of level my game up as well. So shout out to JD. All right, let's move on in the interest of time. Our next segment, which I really enjoy, this is called the game day rituals. So what do you do to be successful in your day-to-day? So let's start with, what's the first thing you do every morning when you wake up? Meditate, coffee, what is it that you do?
I eat breakfast because when I was younger, I did not used to eat breakfast, and I don't know how I survived by not doing it.
Is it the same thing every day? Is there and the reason why I ask this is when I wake up, I'm a supplement guy. I take Shilajit and multivitamins and Kratom. I'm trying all these new supplements all the time to see if I can get an edge. Is there anything in your repertoire that you feel like this actually makes me a little bit more on point as I work through the day?
I do supplements as well. I also I feel like getting the right dosage of caffeine is important. I feel like I'm a tea person now. Coffee, I can do it every so often, but if I do too much, then it's just kind of throws me off for the whole day.
Yeah, same. If I have coffee after 11 a.m., I can't sleep at night. So that's why I've started trying a bunch of other things. Okay. You have a team. You are overseeing a large amount of just change that happens throughout your day. So you have just a massive amount of competing priorities. How are you organizing your day? So are you waking up we're doing this podcast on a Sunday. So are you preparing the night before for your week? How do you organize your priorities? How do you organize your day to make sure you're moving the needle and figuring out the most important tasks?
Yeah, I think kind of to what we spoke to before around having that focus block, I think that is really important. The first 1 to 2 hours of the day, I think, is what really sets the tone.
Sorry to interrupt, do you actually put in your calendar like a block that says focus time or something that actually blocks that out, or just
somebody puts a meeting there, I move it immediately.
So a lot of that's a focus. Okay, so you're at you focus block at the start of your day. Is there anything else that you do to organize your day, your week? How do you plan out? Do you plan out a week in advance? Do you plan out a month, a quarter, a year? How are you planning how you move things along?
How you have your meetings throughout the week is important. If you know that there are things that need to be resolved and by a certain deadline, but you have to make successive decisions along the course, make sure that you those meetings at the front of the week so that you can continue to iterate across the course of the week. And then as a manager, I really try to hinge, important discussion items on, staff meetings, team meetings, and then having one-to-ones throughout the course of the week to make sure that I'm getting feedback on what's going on. I'm able to give feedback. We can continue to work and coach through any open items. I think that's really important. I think it's really important to make sure that you have that rapport with your team. I think one of the most important things about running a successful team is really having them be owners of the work. They do everything in terms of, thinking about how they want to achieve it, how they're going to execute it. And I'm here to really provide additional support and coaching through that. But I would say if you're getting into a point where, you're doing most of somebody's work, you probably need to rethink the way that you're leading.
On the one-to-ones for your direct reports especially, are you doing those weekly? I know there's a lot of managers that are like, yeah, we meet whenever they need something, but how are you structured, especially with your direct reports?
Weekly. I do weekly for everybody. I think even if there isn't necessarily anything like tactical to talk through, it is important, at least for me, to continue to have a connection with my direct reports on, how are they feeling about everything that's going on? Do they have any concerns about what they're doing, or to use it as an opportunity to, what I want people to do is come to me with things that they want to be coached through. So creating space for this is whatever you want to use it for. There are other ways to get updates, right? There are other ways to do checklists of what's going on. So try to find other ways to get that information so that we can really focus on having productive conversations and live one time.
I fully agree with the weekly. You and I, we do a lot of employee relations ER stuff. And a lot of times it's my manager doesn't talk to me until there's a problem and we haven't talked for 3-4 weeks, and losing that connection, even though like no news might be good news to some people. But like you said, just checking in, how are you doing? Even if there's nothing specific, it allows you to have opportunity to, how can I help develop you? So for managers out there, stick to doing weeklies if you can, unless you have too many direct reports, but I do think that's important. Moving on, more practical. So you have your morning, you have your tea, and you have your breakfast. Obviously, hopefully you're eating throughout the day. The day ends. How do you end the day? And then how do you recharge? Do you have any specific habits or any hobbies that you do to maintain balance?
I do try to cook every night just because I feel like obviously going out to eat is really expensive now, but I feel like it is a good way to decompress and feel like, you're more in this physical world. I exercise a lot. I have 2 dogs that always demand attention. So there's plenty to keep me busy, I would say, in that realm.
Are you intentional with, like you say, you cook every day? That's because you have to eat. Are there things that like, I try my best to meditate, even though I don't do it every single day? Is for you, is it the exercise? Is there some rigor or schedule you do there to keep yourself on track?
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty into it at this. I'm pretty excited by it. I think normally, or at least prior to this, it was more like, let me check the box. But again, maybe this is just part of the journey that we're on. I've been really trying to look forward to it so that I can want to do it and want to improve. So, for example, I've been starting to take up running like a lot of people have. And I think that's my new like thing that I want to get better at.
And do you feel that actually helps you when you show up to work, that's a endorphin releaser or a stress reliever? Or do you think that actually affects you?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it makes a big difference.
All the best leaders I have, they really actually have done a lot around the wake up early in the morning to either train, to run, to work out. And that's that athletic, keeping your mind on point, keeping your physical on point.
Yeah. I kind of hate that just to be candid, I kind of hate that I'm saying that because it sounds like such a cliche, and maybe 5 to 10 years ago would have been like, I'm not doing that. I'm not getting up that early but if you're in your early 20s, have your fun. Don't get up at 5 in the morning. There'll be time later in your life where you do.
We have to. All right, let's move to the next segment, the level of advice. Just 2 questions around that one. For aspiring HR leaders, not for the entry level, but if you're going to be an HR manager like you, what's one piece of advice you'd give to someone who's starting out and wants to go to that HR management role that would want to make a big impact, what's one piece of advice?
Practice what you preach, I would say, because I think oftentimes HR people can be some of the worst people at actually following through on their advice when it comes to development or leadership. Not to say that there are necessarily a lot of bad leaders, but I think oftentimes we put ourselves last is how I think that's the best way I would describe it, is we put ourselves last a lot of the times in reinvesting in our own team. So make sure that you don't do that. Make sure that you continue to make yourself a priority.
That's great advice. Like, who looks out for the people that are looking out for the people? You have to do it yourself a lot of the times. Second question around there is, in completely changing gears, our job, especially in the HR business partner world, is around change management. What is your best advice for handling resistance when people do not want to have change within their teams?
Good question. The first thing I would say is you really have to put in the work to understand why someone is feeling like that. And it's going to feel really uncomfortable, I think, to try to dig into what that feeling is. And again, one of our amazing colleagues, Dan Trell, always says that they're not afraid of change, they're afraid of loss, right? And I think oftentimes that's the case for people who don't want to change, right? You get comfortable, you're used to doing something. You don't want to lose that because it means that a lot of things are going to be different. But I think really take the time to sit down and understand why someone is feeling like that. And I think the second most important part of it is if you feel like this is someone who can really come along for the journey with you, and oftentimes, not everybody necessarily will, but if you get the sense that they will, is make sure that they understand that they're supported throughout it, because it's one thing just to say the words, right? It'll be okay. And, we'll be here to support you, but make sure that you follow through with your actions on how you're actually supporting that person.
Good call. And shout out to DC. Actually, I said two questions. Last one, speaking of loss, very quickly, what would be your biggest failure, your biggest loss so far in your career? That's a big question, but maybe you don't want to talk and tell people about it. But I do think that, it's some value in letting people know that we're not perfect. You're not going to be perfect, and curious about you. What was that and how'd you bounce back?
Yeah. So when I was at that first job that I had described, I had a pretty serious personal thing that I was going through at that time. And, in a lot of ways, it actually propelled me to take my career more seriously. But at the same time, I wasn't really taking care of my mental health. By the time that I left that role, I was, I think, burnt out. I think part of it was, and I think also my personal life, which is also kind of a mess. One thing that I was, I think, disappointed was in myself was not feeling like I left on the terms that I necessarily would have. I ended up just, taking a career break. I quit the role. I was like, hey, I just need to get my life together. But I wish that I don't necessarily regret this, but I think it's something that, if I could go back to myself and give myself advice, it would probably be, hey, maybe take a little bit more time on how you want to present yourself in making this decision. Like, obviously, you have a lot of things going on. I think something that I didn't do was I didn't actually let people know that, like, hey, I have things going on in my personal life that are making actual things really difficult. So it was, I think, kind of misunderstood on why was I making this decision. And I think this goes back to something that I've been trying to work on a lot, which is leading a lot more with who I am as an individual, being so, self-conscious or being ashamed of the things, who I am as a person or the things that I'm going through. So to anybody who's listening, I think it pays to be open. It pays, you don't want to be all the way. Sometimes you don't want to put everything out there, but I think it's fair to say, you don't necessarily have to always create such a strong demarcation between who you are as an individual and who you are at work.
That's super huge. I think back my first tech role, company called Bloomreach, guy named Jason Seba. He said to me, you're in HR, Brian, and one thing I want you to always remember is please be the human in the room. Even though you're in HR and you were supposed to just go fire people and do all that stuff, but like, go be the human in the room. And you, Meredith, showing up and being the human and leading with who you are, that matters. And the people resonate to that, even if it's bad news. And so that's a really good call. All right, we're going to wrap this thing up. Our last segment is called the 2-minute drill. Do some rapid fire questions and answers, and then it'll get you out the door. So this segment, this part of the podcast, I ask this to all of the people that are going to be on our podcast, and I'm going to try to see if I can find. I'm going to use ChatGPT, see if I can find some themes about what the best people do. So let's start at the top. What's one skill that HR professionals should master?
Difficult conversations.
Favorite book
All time or like work related?
of all time?
All time.
Actually, I'm going to say both because I actually am very curious about the professional side too.
Okay. Professional side, I was recommended to read Powerful by Patty McCord. She was the CHRO at Netflix for quite a long time, but she had a very unconventional approach to it where she was basically like, a lot of HR processes are really stupid and we shouldn't do these things. So I would say read that before following blindly. And then favorite book. My favorite book series right now it's actually Shadow of the Wind. It's a Spanish kind of a gothic mystery novel. Yeah. So check it out if you want just like a good fast read.
It's awesome. All right. 2 more questions. Life motto, favorite quote or piece of advice that you live by?
There's actually a Buddhist poem that I've been trying to memorize. And one of the quotes is, people will blame you if you say too much, people will blame you if you say too little, and they'll blame you if you say just enough. So I think this has provided a lot of comfort because you're never going to be able to escape blame, especially in HR where tensions are high and oftentimes your decisions are bad and worse.
Especially in our roles. That's amazing. I might get that tattooed or something. That's a really good one. Last one, hidden talent. Any surprising skill that you have outside of work?
I play piano. I played piano for I took lessons for 10 years or so. So I've been trying to get back into that, but it's pretty a useless skill because I can't play in front of anybody because I don't have anything memorized and I choke when I do. So it's not a very good party trick.
You're a sheet reader though. You can actually read and play. And I also played, I think you told me this a while back. You started when you were super young, 4, 5, 6. I started when I was 4, took lessons. My parents forced me until I was 13, 14. And I still can't read sheet music, but I can play by ear. And wow, I'm so
that's
jealous.
That's sort of impressive. I mean, I'm jealous.
No, I'm so jealous of people that can just, there's so many songs I want to play and learn. I hear something on TV and I want to get the sheet music. And I have a piano right here and I have all the sheet music that I can't play. And so I'm really jealous of people that can just do. So maybe I'll get back to practicing. I have my piano collecting dust. So that's a good one. It's interesting. Okay. Well, this has been amazing. I really do think that people listening can understand how they can be better at their role because of our discussion today. It's being intentional. It's really showing up and doing the work. It's being the human in the room. I really appreciate you, Meredith, for being my first podcast guest. I appreciate you for being such a great colleague, a great friend, and I do think that a lot of people are going to take a lot from this. So once again, super appreciated. We'll be obviously talking more. If you have any questions, reach out to me in the info that we have at the bottom of this, and maybe I can get you in touch with Meredith if you need a mentor. My name is Brian Bell. This is the Level Up Career Podcast. I appreciate you all and see you next time. Thanks, Meredith. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Brian. Bye.